It's great to have you here. I'm also very honored to moderate this brilliant panel. We're waiting for Miss Rebecca and also for Andrii, and everybody is ready. My name is Natalia Gumenyuk. I'm a Ukrainian reporter, co-founder of Hromadske TV, which is a civil initiative of the Ukrainian journalists and media, which is run and operated by journalists, and an editor-in-chief of Hromadske International, which is a new source of the information in English about Ukraine. But we have a great panel with a great name, The West and the Rest, Perception of the West in Ukraine and Perception of Ukraine in the West. So here we are. There is Rebecca Harms, a great friend of Ukraine, member of European Parliament, co-chair of the group of the Greens and European Free Alliance, and as well a member of the EU Parliament delegation who often comes to Ukraine. We have also here Stefan Troebst, who is a professor of Eastern European Cultural Studies at the University of Leipzig and the expert on this region. Besides that, he has great expertise on Balkans and Southern Europe. Volodymyr Yermolenko is a philosopher, political scientist, and expert on internews, coming here from Kiev, and as well Volodymyr is a commentator. He's commenting the events about what's happening for a lot of foreign media, and is a bridge between Ukraine and the French media community. And Andrii Portnov is a historian and a Ukrainian historian from Humboldt University of Berlin, where he's based. So the way how we will work, I'll give to everybody maybe 5 more minutes for introduction. With after that, raise the question. There would be a few questions to everybody, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So I think the first, before we start, and maybe we will start with Rebecca, but in general the point would be, if we have been talking a year ago about Ukraine and about on this topic about the perception of Ukraine or perception of the European Union and the West in Ukraine, maybe we would say that there is a lack of knowledge, there is not enough information. Now it looks like there is a lot of information, there is a lot of knowledge, there is maybe sometimes people are sometimes overwhelmed with what had happened. There were a lot of media working. Ukraine became a hotspot, but at the same time, have we learned more? Did we understand? Is it the case that the Ukrainians started to understand Europeans better, the West better, or vice versa? Really had, within this year, had different countries, so Germany in particular, had Germans understood the Ukrainians better? And maybe what are the key points of also misunderstanding when we speak about what are misunderstood at this point? And later when we discuss, we always want not just to see and to talk about the problems we have, but always think what we can do with that. So Rebecca, that is a word for you.
So it's a question which has been often asked since, especially since last year when Euromaidan started. What is known, what is understood about Ukraine in especially the West. And I think, first of all, it's very important to distinguish that the EU, when it comes to Ukraine, has not one perspective. So at least there are 2 perspectives. One perspective from the West of the EU, and one perspective from the east of the EU. Yeah? And so it's, for me, I think here I must not explain how it comes, but the eastern and southeast member states of the European Union, so because of history, because of in parts of the history a common fate with Ukraine, but also because of geography, because of Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. So they know much better what is Ukraine and how the history of Ukraine, how this nation developed. In the West, the knowledge is so. Let's be rough. In the West, mainly people know about Chernobyl. Also, this was the issue which brought me to Ukraine, still in Soviet Union times. I was invited by the Pen Club, the Writers' League of Ukrainian and Russian or Soviet Union writers. But so Chernobyl is a major issue again and again since more than 25 years meanwhile. So what then, a little bit was followed also in international public, in the EU, the whole time, the period of independence. But in this, Ukraine was a country a nation among others. From a former Soviet Union, there was, from my point of view, from what I remember, not a special interest in Ukraine as a country. Then came this Orange or Pomeranian Revolution. Came new heroes suddenly, Ms. Timoshenko, Mr. Yushchenko, and there was a period of interest also in the west of the European Union, but also in those days of Orange Revolution, the main interest was in the east. I would say if we would not have had a strong delegation always from Poland and the Baltics traveling to Ukraine, I would have felt pretty much alone during the days of Orange Revolution. And so after Orange Revolution, the interest got lost again. And so the main perception of Ukrainian issues was via Moscow. So Moscow, Russia was much more interesting for Western European countries than Ukraine. And this even changed not during the negotiations of the agreements with the Eastern Partnership. So in the governments, the national governments, in national politics, in Berlin or in France or in London, meanwhile, it's very, very prominent to say, oh, we made a lot of mistakes. The EU made a lot of mistakes in the negotiation process. I'm, meanwhile, very rough also in this discussion, because the main mistake was with the member states and the governments of the member states, because they were, in their context, there was the lack of interest in those negotiations on the Eastern Partnership. They had agreed on it, but then they left it to Europe, and suddenly they woke up some months before the Vilnius summit. So I see Pat Cox here. They thought, oh my God, are we losing those association agreement because Pat Cox and Kwasniewski and the European Parliament are so interested in the fate of Yulia Tymoshenko? So this was in public attention the main issue, even during this trade war, which had been opened months, nearly a year before Vilnius summit against Ukraine and other countries of the Eastern Partnership. There was no true interest and no visible interest, at least no public shown interest in what's going on in Ukraine. And so that meant that after the big attention for Orange Revolution, the heroes Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, the real interest, public interest on Ukraine came back only shortly before the Vilnius summit, and was focused then on the Euromaidan activities. And so in the first months of Euromaidan, I still felt a growing empathy, also in Western European public discussions for the Ukrainian issue, and the also this very fast nation-building process, which was speed up in the days not only after annexation of Crimea, but it was in a way too late to really understand what is Ukraine. How came that this outbreak was so strong against the oligarch system? So I understood it quite well, and all those people who go to Ukraine since long, they understand that the majority of Ukrainian citizens did not want to continue in this oligarch mode of this country, and for them the failure of Vilnius was kind of hook for showing their wishes for the development of their country, but for Western public and also for Western politicians in the European Union, it was really, I think, even not feasible to understand everything behind Euromaidan so far. And the real problem right now is that in this lack of understanding, in this lack of awareness, what is the story about in those countries like Ukraine, in between Russia and EU today, that in this lack of information, knowledge, understanding, in this lack of developed contacts in between the West and those countries, also on the normal citizens level, this Russian propaganda is spoiling even the rest of, or the minimum of what we have achieved as knowledge about Ukraine.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'll give a word to Stefan Troebst, and I knew that he wants to point out the change of the German public opinion following on the chronology. It was this, especially this summer. So you have your 5-7 minutes, and then we'll discuss.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with Rebecca Harms that the Orange Revolution in 2004 put Ukraine on the mental map of reunited Germany. I'm not so sure about Chernobyl because at that time, still under Soviet Union, Ukraine, Germany was perceived as a sort of region, not as a nation or a state. The fact that Germans up to 2004, so to speak, have forgotten about Ukraine, for me as a historian is rather astonishing because Ukrainian-German relations, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, were extremely intense. Germany several times tried to annex Ukraine in both world wars. Some of you probably remember the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when almost all of Eastern Europe ended up under German hegemony, including all of Ukraine. Fortunately, this peace treaty lasted only a couple of months and then was replaced by another peace treaty which rearranged the map of Eastern Europe completely. Again, in the interwar period, the Weimar Republic supported Ukrainian terrorist organizations in Poland. In Berlin, there was a Ukrainian scientific institute. It's probably not necessary to tell the story of World War II, where all of Ukraine was occupied, divided by Nazi Germany, massacres, Babi Yar, support of UPA, then military conflict with UPA. Also, I would say in the second half of the 20th century, relations were quite intense, particularly between GDR and the Ukrainian then Soviet Socialist Republic, particularly in terms like high-tech technology, metallurgy. There was quite some exchange, also I would say cultural transfer, experts from GDR going to Ukraine and vice versa. Less intense were relations with West Germany, although one should not forget that Bandera was a political emigre in West Germany where he was killed by the KGB. And till the present day, for example, in Munich, in Bavaria, there is a Ukrainian free university which is also a relic of the Cold War. In the wake of the annexation of Crimea this spring by the Russian Federation, German politics and media initially took a stand, I would say, of appeasement. Prominent elder statesmen like former Chancellors Helmut Schmidt and Gerhard Schröder called for direct German-Russian negotiations. Ukraine was hardly mentioned, also there were probably several dozens of talk shows with German and Russian participants discussing the problem of Ukraine, and interestingly enough, it didn't occur to anyone to invite someone from Ukraine. Particularly German Social Democrats follow this appeasement strategy. It's a pity that the President of the European Parliament, Mr. Schulz, is not here, because then we could ask him how come that particularly his party has this appeasement attitude towards Russian aggression. The downing of MH17 then changed things, I would say, considerably. Now German politicians and journalists reluctantly followed public opinion, which blamed by something like 80% Moscow for downing MH17 and for this silent invasion by Russian forces, Russian-supported forces of Donbass. Still, however, I would say in German perception, there are not 15 successor states to the Soviet Union, but primarily one, that is Russia. And as during the Cold War, Germans speak of Russia and the Russians when they mean the USSR and Soviet citizens. I'm afraid the same phenomenon prevails in the English language. Particularly distorted is the German perception of World War II as a German-Russian war. Accordingly, the years 1939 to 1941, when the Third Reich and Stalin's Soviet Union were de facto allies and divided among themselves Poland and other parts of East Central Europe, that does not figure in this perception. In German perception, World War II actually started on June 22nd, 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and that is interpreted today as an attack on Russia and the Russians. And the reasoning goes on that thereby Germany and the Germans have accumulated a large amount of guilt and therefore are not in a position of criticizing even today's Russia, which, as we all know, is quite different from Stalin's Soviet Union. This perception, of course, is highly ahistorical, I would say for at least two reasons. One is that the German attack hit initially and severely the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic and the Belarusian Socialist Soviet Republic, where also the bulk of the fighting took place, and that means that casualties, military, civilian, partisans, and so on and so forth are particularly high in Belarus and Ukraine, much higher percentage than other republics of the Soviet Union, including the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. The other, how to say, myth in the perception, in the German perception of World War II, is that Russia and the Russians liberated us from Hitler's dictatorship. Particularly the Battle of Berlin is invoked As a proof for this fact, when you look at which military units of the Red Army participated in the battle for Berlin, and then you easily find out that rank-and-file NCOs officers predominantly were Ukrainians and Belarusians. Again, a fact which does not figure in the German imagination of World War II. That just as a how to say, to document that German-Ukrainian relations in the 20th century were extremely intense, I would say throughout all of the century, up to the beginning of the 21st century, but that in German perception of Eastern Europe, it is Russia, 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 and then for a while comes nothing, and then come some minor, in German perception, minor states like Estonia or Tajikistan, and finally Ukraine. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And both Andrii and Volodymyr were those who were bridging, being both communicators for the Western audience about what had happened in Ukraine and what happens, but at the same time do their best in order to explain the Ukrainians what it all means. And sometimes it even becomes frustrating when people don't really understand what all this resolution mean, what all this deep concern mean, what is behind that. And maybe Volodymyr will elaborate more on this perspective as well.
Thank you. But I'll start with some probably broader philosophical ideas and then come up to some concrete things. First, to understand some, difference in perceptions, Ukraine, West, Russia, I would draw your attention to the difference, to the profound difference of logics. The West, the European Union is trying to think in terms of positive sum game, right? So the idea that we create a situation when everybody wins, when everybody is expected to. Russia is thinking in terms of zero-sum game. I win, the others lose, or I lose, the others win. This creates a profound difference in logic. Russia is thinking in terms of return of geopolitics. But I have a metaphor that this is geopolitics is a zoopolitics. It's not geopolitics, but a zoopolitics. It's a perception of politics in terms of biology, in terms of return, when we consider states as a kind of a huge animals fighting for survival. And if you follow Putin's Valda speech, you remember this metaphor of a bear and a tiger. So the Russians coming to this, to the world with an idea. When we're talking about the Russians returning to Cold War, I would say that the Russians are returning to some kind of 19th century politics, which were based on the ideas of social Darwinism, when the states, the civilizations, the cultures were considered as a huge animals fighting for survival and for territory. Now, EU politics is a kind of a very different thing. It's a kind of a flower politics. It's a kind of a, not a zoopolitics, but flower politics. The idea is that you put seeds to the ground, and then you expect something to bear fruit, right, in a year or in a decade. This was the philosophy behind the association agreement. Association agreement is basically a flower, some kind of a, an idea that you put seeds and then this would reform, etc., etc. And it's a good idea in times of peace, but it doesn't really work in times of war because you can't really fight the bear with flowers. You can't fight the bear with flowers, with some very long-term thinking. And here, I think we come to this disappointment which is rising in Ukrainian society. I recently held a debate, we organized a debate in Zaporizhia, which is a city close to the war, and there are many people show up, well, some people show up, those who were in the ATO zone, the soldiers, and they asked us to bring this message. course, Ukraine still considers to be a country which is moving towards Europe. But at the same time, in the minds of these people, of course, there is a disappointment because they still consider Europe as fighting with flowers against a bear, against a big enemy. I think that the West sometimes underestimates its strength vis-à-vis Russia. And we talk too much about, you know, this very popular game both in Ukraine and in the West, which is called Putin always wins. Any act Putin has, any act Putin does, he always wins. And this is very dangerous thing both in Ukraine and in the West. Like in Ukraine, we have this perception that Ukraine is losing the information war to Russia, which is not true, I guess. Which is not true. But this pushes government, for example, to this very strange idea of Ministry for Information Policy and the rest. Now, what is perceived in a very negative terms in Ukraine? Something. For example, this idea, which is very popular in the West, that the current conflict was caused by the West bullying Russia, the West, attacking Russia, the West enlarging to Russia. But if you follow, for example, Russia's first reaction to the idea of association agreement, just take the statements of Medvedev or Putin in 2010 or 2011. Well, the policy is, we have nothing against. The association agreement is a sovereign right of Ukraine. Of course it's bad, of course Europe is declining, of course, Europe is decadent. We know it's bad, but it's still the sovereign right of Ukraine. Now it's different. Why? Because Russia came up with this idea of Eurasian Union, for which association agreement is simply incompatible. If you take 2008, there was a compromise between the West and Russia on Ukraine and Georgia. And the compromise was no to NATO, yes to EU. I mean, we say no to NATO to membership action plan, but we say we are okay with all those association agreements. Then the compromise was broken by Russians with this trade war in 2013 and the forthcoming events. But these circulated ideas in the Western press that this is our fault, this is always our fault, that we're guilty before Russia, this is our expansion. Well, this is a very worrying trend, and I think it's also perceived in Ukraine as a very worrying trend. Why? Because first we think that, well, the West is ready for some concessions to Russia, but then more profoundly, we think that the West simply does not believe in its own strength. So it does not believe in its own animality. The West has teeth, and sometimes it needs to show them. Now, he talks about federalization. Well, I tell you that any quote about federalization from a top European politicians, there was a quote from Van Rompuy. Recently, there was a quote from Mogherini. The word federalization was there. Well, it's very, very, very negatively perceived in Ukraine, and for understandable reasons, right? For understandable reasons, for reasons that there is a perception that it is still Russian game behind, etc., etc. Now, what just concrete ideas? What response could be? What response is expected? I think first, this more teeth is expected in terms of sanctions, in terms of other pressure, in terms of, I really agree with Andrew, there was a very good idea that there was a wrong to say initially that there could be no military response. So it was wrong to say, even if you believe there is no military response, well, you shouldn't show you don't have teeth, right? You are not an animal anymore. After the Orange Revolution, we were waiting for 3 years to have some kind of a strategic response from the EU, and this was in forms of association agreement. But the talks began in 2007, 3 years after the Orange Revolution. I think the Ukrainian society is now expecting also this strategic response. We cannot leave things as usual. We cannot make believe that nothing happened, that there is a Euromaidan, then huge victims, then the war, and we continue business as usual, like also in Eastern Partnership, in European neighborhood policy. We have to rethink it, I think, in terms of giving membership perspective, in terms of seeking instruments of providing some security umbrella, non-NATO, of course, because I mean, in Ukrainian expert community, well, people are mostly understand how NATO looks like, how it functions. And another thing is that this approach of, flower-like approach, you make seeds. For example, I'll give you an example. EU is fond of these twinning projects. And one of the successful twinning projects, they consider to be successful. Well, a twinning project is like, you have an expert, comes to Ukrainian ministry, nobody understands what he's doing, he got lots of money, everybody's happy. But one of the twinning projects, for example, was for internal troops. And everybody was happy about the project for internal troops. Does it change something during the Euromaidan? No. I mean, the internal troops were as aggressive as they were used to be. But there is a need to, if there is assistance, huge assistance, and millions of euro throwing to projects, to budget, etc., it has been more concrete assistance. It's not, some abstract like cloudy projects, but concrete things, helping people, helping the refugees. You got the budget of a typical EU project in like 2-3 million. For 2-3 million, you go to industrial site in the center of Kiev and rebuild it to a refugee house for, 100 families. So I would stop on this, but I was probably a little bit critical, but of course I'm staying optimistic. Everything will be fine.
Thank you, Volodymyr. I'll give floor to Andrii to follow up or to respond.
Yeah, thank you so much. Probably so I have an occasion to talk again, but now in my own name, not in the name of Mr. Schulz, but in the name of, let's say, someone who tries to observe and even participate in what is going on in this international debate about Ukraine, mostly in Germany, but also at least partly in countries like Britain, Poland, France, so on. So first of all, of course, if you ask me to give one fundamental principle, key reason where this problem with, let's say, perception of Ukraine lies, I would say that it's the lack of, let's say, acceptance of Ukraine's historical, cultural, and present-day subjectivity or agency. So quite often, in many levels, in a lot of levels, Ukraine is treated as just a battlefield. So just like a place where some real guys, like Russia and the West, or NATO and the Eurasian Union are fighting each other, and Ukraine is just a place to be. And there are a lot of examples how this logic could be used in explaining what's going on. For instance, for me, the best and the worst example of the time is this extremely popular also in German political discourse, the idea that in Ukraine you have regions with the Russian majority. As for instance, German Vice Chancellor said. So why it's so important? Because it implies that speaking Russian automatically means being ethnically Russian and being politically loyal to Putin. And that's exactly Putin's narrative, at least before the last events. Before, because now it's pretty clear in Donetsk, in Luhansk, that it's not so easy to build this so-called Novorossiya. But you have this narrative all the time, and this very simple idea that in case of Ukraine, unlike Poland, unlike even Belgium, if I may say that, you have no kind of straight link, straight connection between the language of everyday communication and your political preferences and your political loyalty. It sounds so simple and evident, but it is still missing in the debate. And that is why I'm telling it all the time, years and years, and it's the same again and again. Now, why it's partly so difficult to promote such a kind of a banal idea into the public, open, political, intellectual debate? I would say that at least partly It is because of the strength of various stereotypes and historical myth about Eastern Europe, especially in the German context. So the stereotypes of Eastern Europe, but not Russia. So Russia is not in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Belarus. Belarus is absent, of course, but no Russia. So this is the region between us and Russia, the region of anti-Semitism, ethnic nationalism, political chaos. And then when you have this stereotype from, from literature, from historical tradition, from all this stuff, you might, even unconsciously, you start talking about the ongoing military conflict, for instance, in these terms. And that is why I would propose also for our discussion a kind of this idea that unfortunately nowadays we are facing again this narrative of Balkanization. So we know this narrative, European narrative of Balkanization in the context of ex-Yugoslavia in the 90s, and now Balkanization is about Ukraine. So when you are explaining, for instance, what's going on in Donbass through this perspective of commercial civilizations, Russian and Ukrainian and Western, or stuff like that. And that is why my like a paradoxical maybe proposal as a historian would be that one of the aims, the task, the challenges is to, for all of us, is to promote historical thinking, to free our perception of the current events from old-fashioned historicized interpretations. Because we hear all the time historical rights, this stupid discussion about who has historical rights for Crimea. Something Russia, no, Ukraine. My proposal is to get rid of the entire narrative, is to explain that the very narrative of historical rights is dangerous, is undemocratic, and leads to violence. And not to say, no, it's we who have the rights. This is unfortunately very much the case in Ukraine. The same about historical guilt. Stefan brilliantly pointed it out. This idea that we are guilty for the Russians, that is why we should not criticize Putin now. Which for me, as a person raised in Russian culture, sounds almost unbelievable. And the last point in this respect, we should also accept this very strange idea, and actually I'm grateful to Natalia Gumenyuk because it comes from my conversation with her about Donbass, that sometimes there should be no historical precedent to violence. Because you see, you could always try to explain what's going on in Donbass by talking about, I don't know, UPA underground, or civil war in 1970-1980. But it gives us no explanation at all. Because actually, I would really say, this was a Russian tactics, not strategy, tactics in Donbass, is more or less like that. Violence first, nice interpretations later. So, first, terrible violence, and then we said, it's Novorossiya, it's people, it's Novorossiya. They are thinking in different ways. Narod Novorossiya. What does it mean? It has no meaning at all, at least in a sense of explaining the origins of violence we have there. And maybe the last point here is that, in my view, it's very much the problem of, let's say, so-called Western discourse. Of course, it's not a kind of like unified discourse, because it is German, it's French, it's British, it's Polish. Sometimes it's highly controversial inside this national, but still, in my view, it is also a problem for Ukraine. So for us, for Ukrainian politicians, journalists, intellectuals, whatsoever, to find out and to formulate Ukraine's agency and subjectivity. Because it's not clear, let's say, in the internal debate as well. What does it mean, for instance, being Ukrainian? If you are Żydo-Banderowicz, as Andrii told us, if you are a Russian-speaking person, if you are Crimean Tatar and a Muslim, very interesting, and still a Ukrainian, what does it mean? So, and it's especially interesting because Ukraine, unlike the countries, let's say, these new EU members, like the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, so like that, it's a country which, it is in my view, is much more internally heterogeneous after the collapse of the communism. In other words, you could not just say that like Ukraine or Ukrainian means like speaking Ukrainian, or even just like voting for some, like for this political party or the other political party. So it's a big question how this heterogeneity, religious, language, historical, whatsoever, of Ukraine should be reconceptualized as a chance for the national building project and not as an obstacle. Because we have now a very strong, for instance, anti-Donbass narrative within Ukraine, which in my view is one of the biggest dangers for the future, for the democratic future of Ukraine. But people who think of themselves as Democrats, liberals, and pro-European intellectuals, they are producing this narrative all the time. And now it's the question, like, what does it mean in this broader context again? So you see there are like more questions, of course, than answers. I just want maybe to support Volodya's point that the European Union should have a strategy to Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. Because you see, this strategy could be very, let's say, highly unpleasant for me personally, let's say, or for all of us. But doing politics in such a situation without any strategy, without just this naive belief that we could prevent the real war by showing that we are as peaceful as possible, it's kind of, let's say, it's a very dangerous position. And I would dare to say that even now, after all the last events, after all those terrible stories, we could not say that the European Union has a strategy for Ukraine, has a strategic vision in terms of all the issues: economy, energy, defense, politics, and so on. And without strategy, we could not hope for a reasonable and peaceful solution to this situation.
Thank you, Andrii. And already you and the speakers mentioned what can be done to free the thinking from this historical perspective, to show more teeth for Europe. And I encourage everybody to think shortly, and I'll ask the question in a couple of minutes about what can be the strategy, maybe being more concrete, coming with some results. But before, Stefan, there is a question for you as a person who is an expert on the Balkans as well. So is it really the case? Do you feel that there is this Balkanization of the understanding of what's happening in Donbass? You know, with this war of the people we don't know what, and they're just causing something, you know it better.
Yes, I think there are quite some parallels. Insofar as there is this perception, this outside perception that obviously the DNA of the inhabitants of certain parts of Europe is different from the DNA of the inhabitants of other parts of Europe, and that there is simply nothing to be done about it. That was very strong in the post-Yugoslav war, which incorrectly was called Balkan War. There was no war in the Balkans, there was no war in Greece or Albania or Bulgaria. There was only war in one state, one falling apart state, Yugoslavia, but still immediately this negative stereotype of Balkanization, which had been coined in the beginning of the 20th century and then had been transferred to the decolonization process of Africa, when suddenly there was this discussion that Africa now is Balkanized. And so it's a sort of traveling concept, with which, however, doesn't explain anything.
And Rebecca, there is something else for you. Because in time of conflict, it's not something you like to focus on the misunderstanding. Maybe better to find what unites the people. But at the same time, you usually advocate for Ukraine in the West, here in Brussels, in Berlin. But for you as a person who often comes, what you do not understand about current Ukrainian situation, what is missing for you in order to bridge all these things?
So, one sentence to this, what Mr. Troebst just said. So, this idea that on one continent some nations are better made for democracy than others. This is really one of the fundaments, the roots of the success story of Russian propaganda also. and especially in Germany. So I'm getting sometimes rather cynical, but I'm sitting in public events in Germany and I'm listening to citizens in the West and in the East. Yeah? They are explaining me that not every nation is so perfectly made for a perfectly functioning democratic system as we the Germans. Yeah? And it's so strange, meanwhile, how easy it comes from the mouth of participants in public events in Germany, this sentence, yeah, this democratic model might not fit to the Russians, and they are talking about all of them outside of the European Union, and they say, you can see it already in Bulgaria, it doesn't fit. So this is part of the public discourse in Germany, and it's especially for those who have experience with German history and are trying to also connect now the whole picture of European history to the German discussion. It's really a tough time. So when it comes to Ukraine, and your question was on
what you do not understand, what is still bothering you maybe in the situation in Ukraine, in order to articulate it better and to be this, agency which can explain what's happened there and help to the understanding of Ukraine in the West.
Yeah. So
what is missing for you?
Sometimes Ukraine or actors for Ukraine, they fit perfectly into all these images created by not the friends of Ukraine. What I would like also to highlight in this discussion on Europe needs a strategy. Yeah? Yes, this is true, and we had not a clear strategy. Without the Euromaidan movement and the strong activism on the streets last winter, without Russian intervention, probably we would not have had the association agreement as we got it so far. Yeah? So we have no strategy. We are reacting, we need a strategy, but also on the Ukrainian side, there must be now a strategy to be followed. So there must be a decision on priorities. Let's put aside the war. So we need a common strategy concerning the solution, the better solution for the war in the east of Ukraine. But all the rest, so how to deal with the energy situation. And so there is not only the mistakes committed, the problems with mistakes committed in Brussels. So the ongoing concentration only on the gas supply from Russia. I'm really fed up with this, yeah? But there's also not really a counterpart from Ukrainian side telling the Europeans it's wrong only to discuss with the Russians on the gas transfer, because it will not work. And our demands are this and that, and we have the problems in the coal supply and in the heating system. And how can we fix it without only paying the European support into the big accounts of some oligarchs who are waiting the money to come from Europe right now. So how to make something out of this situation? So there is also in Ukraine the need to recognize that the responsibility is now on both sides. It took 10 years, from 2004 to 2014. I don't know how often me and some colleagues have been in Kiev in this time in between. But if we miss the opportunities now, if we are not able to prioritize our reform projects now and to really work on a common strategy, then it will take, again, a very long time. Yeah, and so it's now, and I sometimes, so if I see the discussion on the pensions, for example, and the supply for Eastern Ukraine, I understand it's very difficult, but I don't really know why there is an ATO operation ongoingly, and so some of the citizens of Ukraine And there are millions of those citizens of Ukraine are all overnight in a situation that they fear completely losing all of their rights. So we need a strategy, but on both sides.
I'll really encourage you further to come up with maybe some more steps about the strategy. But before I really ask you, can you all define how you name what happens in Ukraine? I especially I do not say any word which we usually see in the media, but you know there are always very different definitions, and sometimes it also creates a lot of misunderstanding and confusion by the way you define the crisis wherever.
I have a definition of Maidan, which is a little bit different. I call it a revolution of the giving. In Ukrainian, Revoluция Darunku. What I meant by that is that the most paradoxical thing on Maidan is that basically Maidan happened inside of an oligarchic society. The oligarchic society is not only about the oligarchs, but about oligarchic thinking as a way of life. And oligarchic thinking is a rent-seeking. When you take more than you give, when you try to construct a society, a model of life, when you take the resources much more than you invest and you give. And the Maidan was completely different because people were inspired by the sense of a giving, of sacrificing themselves, their time, their money, their jobs, their lives, even, etc. And it was kind of a revolution of thinking when people were giving much more than they were taking. And it was kind of this birth of solidarity, which is now continuing in voluntary.
But if you speak also about Crimea and Donbass, how you describe what happened there, can you give a definition, Volodya?
Annexation. I mean, the Crimea is an annexation, and Donbass is a war, the Ukrainian-Russian war. I mean, it's also interesting. We're debating the concepts of the civil war. If there is a civil war or there is an invasion, I think there are a little bit elements of both. But I remind you about the tactics, for example, of Russia also in Moldova or in Georgia. First you provoke a conflict, and then you invade in order to defend somebody. So the civil war, the elements of civil war is an element of the invasion strategy. Because you invade to protect, you cannot just invade. You invade to protect. And I think this debate between civil war and invasion is a little bit wrong.
So, Rebecca, how you define? If you sometimes it's needed to be short, and if you need to say what happens, both about Maidan and the situation in the Eastern South.
So in Maidan,
Is it right? Yeah.
in the Maidan, for me clearly it was revolution, and very much against the oligarch system. So with all the details, so many people know what it means for a nation. But what I understood only better when I visited the East in summer is that probably also the East would have needed the same revolution against the oligarch system, but it was because the problems in Donbass, with this oligarch system are even worse from my point of view than in the rest of the country. So they were since long disconnected as a part of Ukraine from the rest of Ukraine, and therefore, in parts, this hate against oligarchs took another development, and so annexation of Crimea, I agree, but so invasion or war in Donbass, so the oligarch system in a way paved the way for success of what happened in Donbass.
Stefan, and as a scholar, what definition you will bring?
In military terms, I would characterize what is going on in Donbass as low-intensity warfare. In political terms, I would probably call it a creeping invasion by armed forces of the Russian Federation. I also agree with Andrii that that is not something invented by Putin, but that has been a phenomenon also of Boris Yeltsin's Russia. What we saw, for example, in the Dniester Republic. I was particularly shocked this summer to learn that one of the most dangerous war criminals of Soviet times, a KGB official by the name of Vadim Antyufeyev, who in 1990-91 was active in the Baltic Republics, who then in 92 reappeared in the Dniester Republic under a different name of Shevtsov, became the head of the regional KGB. This summer was nominated Minister of Interior Affairs, I think, of the People's Republic of Luhansk or Donetsk. So this is an extremely experienced specialist for how to create mischief of all kinds, who was trained in the Soviet Union, practiced his trade under Yeltsin, and now under Putin became an even more important figure.
And Andrii.
I agree actually with all the definitions proposed. I would also like to remind the metaphoric definition mentioned in the previous discussion, like Ukraine's war for independence. I think that it sounds a bit very much, but in fact it's very much about it in my view, because the connect the Soviet Union, as we know, at least in Ukraine, it went peacefully, without any, let's say, bloodshed, military conflict, stuff like that. And now, after 22, 24 years of the connected Soviet Union, we really have a question actually about everything, about the borders of future Ukraine, about the political structure in future Ukraine, about the administrative division, and so on. So that actually there are all the questions that were not seriously asked and answered during the post-Soviet years. And that is why I like this metaphor of war for independence. I would also like to say that I'm highly critical, and it's delicately speaking, highly critical, of the present-day treatment of the Ukrainian citizens in Donbass by the Kyiv government. I am happy to use this occasion to tell it, in public. I'm just a citizen of Ukraine, but it's absolutely unprecedented and unbearable, and it will cause a lot of problem to Ukraine. I'm pretty sure about it in the nearest future, in terms of mass media perception and so on, human rights and so on. And at the same time, I'm very cautious, and I was also very cautious with the idea of civil war, because I've noticed, at least in the German discourse, that people who eagerly speaks about the civil war, at the same time, they would never, usually, accept the fact of any Russian intervention. Because the narrative of the civil war gives you a chance to describe the entire conflict as a local story. Like civilians on both sides, nationalists and someone else, and Soviets, Ukrainians and Russians. And that is why I find, especially like in public debate, this notion of civil war very dangerous, because of course when it comes to the sufferings of the civilians, of course it is very much a kind of a civil war. But when it comes to the question of the origin of the conflict, I would really prefer to stress on the importance of intervention, on the factors examples mentioned by Troebst as well, so like the presence of the people from Transnistria and Chechnya and so in these events and like that. But still nowadays, let's say the treatment, the politics towards the regions controlled by those so-called republics and to the refugees and so on, is one of the biggest challenges for the Ukrainian government. They have a lot of challenges, of course, a lot, but this one is very important because, last but not least, it is about human life. It's about human lives and death of people every day. So it's not an abstract issue, it's a very concrete question. And of course the same is true for the Crimea, for the people who were forced or who decided to leave Crimea, or for the Crimean Tatars and other people on the peninsula who still have a lot of problems in this new reality.
Okay, thanks a lot, and please prepare your questions. But before, it just there would be another round, and right after you will be the first. So I encourage you then to come up with some maybe strategy. Some of you already mentioned it, both from the European side and also from the Ukrainian, to be probably maybe be very specific. But at the same time, I want to throw some other issues which we hadn't raised. I remember when working in Crimea in early February, yeah, there were a lot of people saying that, you know, like the unemployment in the European Union is 50%, why there is no unemployment in Russia. And all these things about, you know, all the things about the human rights and LGBT rights, and which are misused by Russian propaganda, it's all there. So we see a lot of misunderstanding by some of the Ukrainians, not just Russians, but a lot of Ukrainians about what Europe is about. Another issue is that sometimes it's, we understand that Ukraine is a subject, and it's not, there is a talks between Brussels and Moscow, geopolitics, sphere of influence, but at the same time, the talk is still there because it's about Russia. If it was just about Ukraine, maybe there won't be even that many discussion. And so how you see, how we can also both see it as something good and bad, and what gives you, there is a lot of criticism always in these kind of events, but also what give you the reason for optimism, that also may be the issue you would like to raise. So shortly, for 10, like maybe 10 minutes for all, we'll give a few words.
Okay, so from the EU side, I will speak about institutional projects, not just giving money again. But we can use this occasion to criticize something, because the German Minister of Foreign Affairs just gave a lot of money, 5 million euros, for Ukrainian projects. There'll be a lot of nice conferences in Berlin, people meeting in big places, but it has nothing to do with any institutionalization, and I'm against it. Because every euro or every hryvnia should be used properly, and not just for, you know, exactly. That's first. From Ukrainian side, it's very important finally to know and to understand the EU better, and rationally, because it's still about this mythology thinking. It should be rational analysis, and of course also have some optimistic hopes for the projects like Chromatsky International, for instance. Let's see. And about strategy, very simple. It's pretty clear, hopefully not just me, but to everyone here, that there could be no serious EU-Ukrainian strategy without serious EU-Russia strategy. They're absolutely interrelated. So we could not like solve the Ukrainian problem and say, Russia will do it later. Or vice versa. No way. So it should be all together in this respect.
Rebecca, and beside that, there were sometimes there were discussions about the Marshall Plan. They were really popular among the intellectual community. At some point, I even remember they were already there in the December. You know, comparing the help Poland got when up to 90 billions of euros in 90s. We can discuss how feasible is that, but in general, what is your perspective? The solutions.
So I very much agree with what has been said, that the money which is now going to be transferred is connected or comes with conditions. So conditionality matters a lot, because otherwise we will solve, for example, the problems with lack of energy for 2 months. But nothing which is wrong in the system, yeah, will be different after winter or next winter. And therefore, also, even in spite of the fact that it sounds tough, yeah, in this period of the year when winter is close, I think especially now the money in the energy sector should be connected to a clear set of conditions for reforms. Otherwise, Mr. Akhmetov and others will have a party that they continue their business without changing the structures of the whole energy system, which is really in big need for major changes. I would say, for me, beyond this energy issue, so institutions matter a lot for the functioning of the state. And I would say we should, as soon as possible, stop the whole nonsense around federalization, because this does not at all fit to the needs for reforms in Ukraine. So it's about empowerment of local and regional institutions towards the central level, and how we achieve the functioning of the institutions of the state in crisis is of major importance for the success of the new Rada, the new government, and President Poroshenko. And for example, these nasty discussions on the rights of citizens in Donbass, or also the rights of the refugees, internal refugees in Ukraine, are deeply connected to the question whether a state is functioning for all of its citizens or not. And it should be very, very high on the agenda.
The next sessions would be devoted to the reforms and to the EU solution. Therefore, maybe not just in this regard, but also regarding the better understanding and more clear perception. What is your take on it, Stefan, with this round of?
Speaking of institutionalization, I have the moderately positive news that on January 1st, 2015, that is in 3 weeks' time, the German federal government will found a research institute focusing on social sciences and humanities on the CIS region. That's a long-standing plan which never was realized. Now suddenly with a new situation, everything went smoothly, and various federal ministries promised to contribute huge amounts of money to the new institution. What worries me, looking at the German discussion in Germany, I mentioned there was this maybe not change of opinion, but change of arguments during this summer. But still, for example, when you use in German discussion a term like containment, then you get a hysterical reaction, then you are cursed as a warmonger, cold warrior, and other even more unpleasant things. That is, for example, the reason why the proposal which in the international discussion came up that one should consider excluding the Russian Federation from the SWIFT agreement in Germany is not discussed, because if you would mention that, that would be probably the end of your public existence. There was a former member of European Parliament, Werner Schulz, member of the Green Party like Rebecca Harms, who I think in May came up with a proposal that one should look into the Montreux Agreement of 1936 on the Straits, that is Sea of Marmara, Dardanelles, Bosphorus, because there's an interesting clause saying that Turkey has the right to close the straits for foreign warships, not only in case of war, but even in case Turkey feels somehow threatened. And Schulz's proposal was that Turks should think about whether the annexation of the Crimea by Russia, plus the violation of human rights of Crimean Tatars, is a threat, can be perceived as a threat by Turkey. Of course, Erdogan not even took this proposal serious, which somehow contradicts the Turkish attitude that the Crimean Khanate was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. The Republic of Turkey is a successor state, is the main successor state of the Ottoman Empire. Ergo, the Republic of Turkey is somehow responsible also for territories which previously have been part of its vassal states, which include the Crimea. As I mentioned, Schulz earned a sort of shitstorm in Germany, and there was no reaction in Turkey so far.
Okay, and
So there is, so Putin and Mr. Erdogan are getting closer and closer. So it's runner came too late.
Volodymyr, it's your last comment shortly. Not the last, but in this round, and then there would be questions.
On SWIFT, there is a joke from Ukrainian poet Andrii saying that Russia was turned off from SWIFT and switched on to Kafka. So optimism. About optimism, I think the optimism. We are optimistic if we think in the long-term perspective. Because I asked a question, what is the enlargement of the European idea? The enlargement of the European idea comes first, then the enlargement of European institutions. When you go back to, 84 and ask Milan Kundera where are the frontiers of Europe, he would tell you that the frontiers of Europe de facto are between the West and the Warsaw Pact, but actually they are between Poland and Ukraine. Now they're shifting much more eastwards, and I think this should be a starting point of any strategic thinking, because I think it's inevitable. It's an evolution of this region is inevitably will bring you more individualistic, more creative persons, society focused on creative class. This is a very good concept of Richard Florida, the creative class. In some 50 years, you will have Eastern Europe, in Russia too, in Belarus, mostly people much more individualized, I think, than today, and much more in line with this European idea than today. And I think we should start from that and think in terms of, and in this sense, well, for me it's inevitable, the accession of Ukraine in some kind of European structure is inevitable, and we just have to think in this long-term perspective.
So please say whom you address your question, and now we have a question from Mr. Ostap Semerat, who is a Ukrainian Member of Parliament from the Committee of European Integration and former Minister of Cabinet of Ministers.
So the question is to Mr. Portnov. During your presentation, you mentioned human rights and said that human rights in Ukraine are violated by Ukrainian government. Can you specify what you mean special? Because that is a very important issue in discussion and even in Ukrainian and European policy. And just want to clarify what is the violation.
So, no, I said something different, absolutely different actually. So please don't misinterpret me in such a brutal way. I said that if Ukraine will continue politics like that, like now, concerning, and actually it was even Rebecca made this point much harder than me, so you see that it's already a European issue. It's not a unknown historian from Berlin, it's a member of the European Parliament. So if we continue its politics, at some point, very, very soon, one of the main anti-Ukrainian arguments in the international debate would be, and now it's my quote, it's my assumption for the bad future we should try our best to overcome, would be that Ukraine violates the rights of its own citizens. So please, I'm asking you personally here, in front of TV cameras, I'm asking you and all the other people from Ukraine, please do your best to prevent this situation, because it's your responsibility. And if we fail to do that, we as Ukrainian society, it will be a big problem. Also in terms of perception of Ukraine in Europe. That was my point.
Yeah, please, shortly.
Just shortly, I think the most hot topics discussed is pensions to people in Donbass, cutting pensions. And the second issue is the non-resident status of inhabitants of Crimea, which are basically the concrete stories people are suffering.
If I may, that is really the great discussion. And please don't misinform people about cutting pensions, because government doesn't cut these pensions, and we are paying all pensions in time, except those people who are living on the territory that is not under Ukrainian authority control, because that is impossible, and you absolutely understand this. And governmental decisions about this problem was made maybe a few weeks ago, and we proposed the decision of that, and people can choose at least two ways how to get this social support. And the second about entire displaced persons, you know that we established a few months ago the procedure, and then Ukrainian Parliament 2 months ago adopted a law in cooperation with European partners and OSCE, and our procedure is absolutely clear and easy. During 10 days, anybody can do this. So I'm asking you, we are here to present Ukrainian position, and please inform all of our partners correctly, please.
Rebecca wants to, thanks a lot for your contribution. Rebecca wants to add
I
something.
think again on this issue of pensions, because there is nobody who would not understand that it's very difficult to bring the money, Kiev money, Ukrainian money, which comes from common Ukrainian funds to the citizens in Donbass and Lugansk region. I don't know whether it's impossible, so I discussed with many people who are delivering whatsoever in those regions, volunteers who are going there day by day delivering everything. And I think it's very important not to give up on the responsibility for citizens of Ukraine. And as long as you are fighting also for the integrity of the territory, the rights of the citizens should matter if you don't want to feed the arguments of those who are against the functioning entity of Ukraine. For me, it's really a very serious issue, and it should be discussed in between the European Union, international institutions, and the Ukrainian government, and on the IDPs. So I don't like this abbreviation, internally displaced persons. I met enough people during last weekend who face major problems to get their rights as refugees. And I met also a lawyer who's trying to help Crimeans who are refugees from Crimea to get their rights, for example, towards Privatbank. And it's really a very difficult fight, and I think it's really important that the Europeans and the Ukrainians agree on those ways how to guarantee the rights for all citizens of Ukraine.
I think we definitely will have you, but we have to follow the order, because there are people used to raise their hands. Please, your question, and we'll come back.
I just want to answer, not to ask.
I think you'll definitely answer. Otherwise, there are 4 people waiting so far.
Richard Butwick, Pavlikovsky. I have the privilege of holding the European Parliament Bronislaw Geremek Chair of European Civilization at the College of Europe. My question is addressed in the first place to Professor Portnov, although potentially it could go to any of the panel. Is not the underlying reason for the receptiveness of Western European opinion to Russian propaganda, including the cultural and historical narratives explained by Professor Troebst and Ms. Harms, simply a profound and appalling ignorance about the history, the culture, including the civic heritage of all of the countries which are placed between Germany and Russia. And I'm afraid that such ignorance is even worse in the countries that are placed to the south and to the west of Germany, even if perhaps the consequences in terms of public debate are not quite so severe. If Neville Chamberlain could say about Czechoslovakia in 1938 that it is a faraway country of which we know nothing, despite the shrinking of the world, is that not even more true today about attitudes towards Ukraine? This ignorance, these corrosive narratives of balkanization, they eat away at the very idea of the European project. There is a temptation to say, as I think Professor Portnov hinted at, that the problem is at least perceived as too much history, too many ancient blood feuds, and therefore that historical claims should be ignored. But I would rather say as a historian that the answer is not to pay less attention to history, but to study that history better, and to study the history of all of Europe, and in particular the countries between Germany and Russia. Thank you.
Respond on that.
So you're absolutely right about ignorance, exactly. That's something I'm facing every day, all the time. Please, again, please, maybe I have written it here. I've said that it's not about like teaching or talking about history less. It's about promoting historical thinking. Because if we know history, I would dare to say, really try to promote this thinking, then we will never start a discussion about the historical rights for Crimea. You see, that was my point. My point was not that we should not study history. Of course, we should study much more than before. And you know, for instance, that until now, I was very happy for this Stefan's news, but until now in Germany, for instance, in the big country, the biggest country with so lot of universities, there are no university positions in Ukrainian history, in Ukrainian literature. There are only a few places where you could have Ukrainian language. In Berlin, where I'm teaching now, there is no option to study Ukrainian, even to learn Ukrainian at the university level. I'm the only one who has one seminar per week about Ukraine. That's all. Could you imagine that? So it's not just ignorance, it's something unbelievable. But what's interesting, because when it comes to the arguments, when I'm saying that we should start doing it, we should promote institutions, they're saying like, oh, but you see, now it's practiced in Ukraine, tomorrow it will be in Syria or somewhere else. We could not start like positions for any country where the crisis is. So there is no idea that this Ukrainian problem, this war in Ukraine, is very much a European war. It's not just for Ukraine, it's also for Europe. It's very much a war for Europe. And how to promote this idea, that's a very good question. But again, in order to promote it and to fight this ignorance, we should be very, let's say, cautious and careful with various attempts, let's say, from official Kremlin side, from many other sides, to use so-called historical arguments in their way of explaining why should we, support Putin or step aside. And that's a real challenge. Of course, you agree about.
Okay, so let's keep the question and answers very brief. Here, it's your turn.
My name is Marcin Starzewski, Bronisław Geremek Foundation. I have the question to Rebecca Harms. You nicely described the Maidan revolution as the revolution against the oligarch system. Could you please try to assess the outcome of this revolution? In particular, I would be interested how far from the oligarch system, in your view, is the current president, Petro Poroshenko?
So to judge on single persons in Ukrainian politics, I leave it to Ukrainians. But I would love to talk about structures which are for me very promising since the Euromaidan revolution. because so there are still problems with the process of change, and all the new people are not really the new people. The change in Ukrainian politics, in the elections, when it comes to important players, is not that deep as some might see it who have not been in Ukraine before. But so to judge on the government and the president, it's really up to Ukrainians and not to me. But the structures. So I'm really very, very optimistic on the new situation in the parliament. I advocated, so beginning last winter in sessions in the Maidan and around the Maidan, that those people were fighting in this revolution, not coming from the Rada already or from influential positions, but coming from the regions, from small business, etc., etc., that they are not fighting for revolution, but making the change possible by taking over political responsibility, for example, by becoming member of the parliament. And so I think, so as far as I can judge it, the change in the European Parliament and the idea of this Euromaidan platform in the Parliament is a very promising idea and should be picked up by the EU and supported also by the EU with a very, very thorough, careful, planned cooperation, because the EU tends, so the institutions, the players on top of the institutions, they tend to talk a lot about civil society, democratic change, about institutions that are important as NGOs, etc. But in the daily business of the European institutions, it's much easier to meet again and again only with presidential, administration people, with the players in the government. So Gumenyuk and Portnov, they are really perfect because they are so perfect in communication, because they speak English. But there are many, many other peoples to be taken now serious from the European side. On the regional level, since Euromaidan, we have all these initiatives on lustration and on anti-corruption fight. Those initiatives, they must be strengthened. Yeah? So instead of talking about federalization, and instead of inviting whatsoever NGOs across Europe, because the German government and others are investing in dialogue, there should be a decision how we strengthen this bottom-up process of change in Ukraine. And also on this, I think if we fail now, it will be very tough in 1 year's time or 2 years' time, because the tensions in Ukraine around these questions of change, around corruption, the tensions around this are really tough tensions. And so I hope that many people in Parliament in Kiev understand better that it's really now the opportunity, and that they have to stay with the citizens, and they are not allowed to disappear again in this nice elitary bubble of Kiev, Verkhovna Rada and surroundings. They have to be connected to the citizens.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have 5 more minutes, and we have already questions, so very brief.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Artemenko, Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. First of all, I want to thank you all the panelists for the good insight, and especially the metaphor about flower and zoopolitics. My question regarding the topic of today is West and the Rest. And in my imagination, West is not only the EU, but the US as well, and how our Ukrainian speakers will maybe comment on perception of the US in Ukraine, and maybe our European speakers will elaborate more on perception of the US in Europe, but in context of conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Please really ask you to be very short and very brief on that. We still have questions. So
US does less, but has better public relation strategy than the European.
Andrii?
I could just add that one of the principal cultural reasons for this Putin segment of German or French, especially German and French political discourse, is a kind of an anti-American sentiment, which is pretty strong in both societies. It is linked to, let's say, post-war cultural history of Germany and France, and that is why I'm asked all the time. Any talk I'm giving in Berlin, I have a question like, and now like, tell us how the American money will be distributed on the Maidan. It comes always. So that's one of the key issues raised and manipulated all the time by the Russian disinformation politics.
And there is a question from Mr. Rafat Chubarov, a Ukrainian member, founder and the chairman of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis.
Щиро дякую. Дякую всім за чудовий виступ. Є два моменти, які я хотів би для себе з'ясувати. Пані Ребека Хармс, можливо, тут були якісь з перекладом. Я цитую: анексія Криму – це є анексія, але те, що в Донбасі – це агресія. Чи треба от такі слова розуміти так, що оскільки окупація Криму Російською Федерацією відбувалося без військового опору з боку України, дає якісь додаткові важелі чи аргументи на користь Росії? Бо було сказано. Так, і друге в мене до пана професора Troebsta про можливість Туреччиною закриття проливів для кораблів. Чи тут ми маємо чинне діючі міжнародні справи, які дозволяють Туреччині? Дуже дякую.
Rebecca will respond.
So the occupation and annexation of Crimea was, from my point of view, and I share this with the majority of members of the European Parliament, was violation of international law. It was the point which defined that Russia is ready to not longer accept the order of peace on this continent. And so this is the legal or the perception based on international law, which led also to part of the sanctions decided against Russia since the annexation of Crimea. But also, I know there was not the possibility to go to the details. I know about many violations of rights of citizens. I know about violence, torture, killing, kidnapping of Crimean citizens. I know about the aggression against the minority of Crimean Tatars living in Crimea. So there are many human rights violations which should be followed all the time also in Crimea.
And Mr. Troebst, so I would maybe explain, the question was about the legal base when you were speaking about this closure of the channel by Turkey.
As I mentioned, the Montreux Convention of 1936 has a special article, Article 21, which allows Turkey to close the straits not only in case of war, that means once Turkey is in war with another power, but also in case Turkey feels its security threatened. Quite an unusual article probably today in international conventions. One would not insert such an article. in 1936, one inserted one, and the convention is perfectly in power. So theoretically, Ankara could come up with the argument Russian behavior in the Black Sea region threatens their security. That is why we closed the straits for Russian warships. That would be a serious blow for Russia, because then communication to its naval base in Syria, in Tartus, would be much more complicated, because then Russian warships would have to come from Murmansk all the way through the Mediterranean, and that would make things much more complicated.
Thank you.
But
And
that in theory, there is no Turkish political practice.
we have the last point. Please introduce yourself.
Maria Ivanova, member of Ukrainian Parliament. I just want to come back to that point when the Ukrainian government has to take responsibility for that people who is on occupied territory. I would like to represent Irina Gerashenko, and we together almost every week we are on Donbass. And that is why we can say that Ukrainian government doesn't do anything. I just want to say that on July, at the beginning of August, the first humanitarian convoy of Ukrainian government was delivered to Donbass. But International Red Cross was not able to negotiate with the terrorists, and we were not able to deliver this humanitarian products and everything which need people. But Russian convoy, as you know, comes every 2 weeks. And such an examples that still Ukrainian government, we didn't stop the gas, providing the gas and electricity to that occupied territory. And such an examples, just 1 week ago when we have been in Luganska Oblast near Shastia, these IDP people that were more than 500 people, they were running from this occupied territory. They were bombed, they were shooting by crowds on this conflict line. Our Ukrainian soldiers, they were hiding them in fire station, and they bombed this fire station. That people could just leave, who just left their territory. And also the second point, for example, repairs. Electricity repairs. The OSCE agreed that these repairers come to the conflict line to repair the electricity. And in 1 hour they were shot again. So they just left, and we didn't solve the problem. So the question is, these terrorists, with whom do they fight? With Ukrainian citizens, which are on the territory of Donbass, or with Ukrainian soldiers. And I can tell you that every day we have more and more wounded civilian people in the hospitals. It's really very complicated wounds. So that is why it's, Ukrainian government knows what to do, but unfortunately they are not able to do on the occupied territory now what we need.
Thanks a lot. So that was a final remark, and as I remember from all the discussion, it was not the issue that the government doesn't do anything, but it's not doing enough, and there might be more ways.
With international institutions.
Together with the international institution, of course. So I please thanks our panelists, the speakers, for the great. The lunch will take place on the second floor. You can go to the lift, and there will be Martin to the elevator, and then Martin will show you. And the next session will start at 2 o'clock. It will be about the reforms ahead of Ukraine. Thank you so much.